20. Human personhood. 1. Humanity's uniqueness is the specific relation God takes up with us. This relation is not itself a resemblance. The image of God, if we are to use this phrase comprehensively for humanity's distinctiveness, is simply that we are related to God as His conversational counterpart. With these propositions in place, however, we are free to recognize what may indeed be called a human resemblance to God, and at the very place where the tradition located it. Because God speaks with us, we know He is personal. As we answer Him, we too are personal. It is often and convincingly claimed that personhood first became a metaphysically deep concept within the Christian doctrine of God, and especially within the thinking of the Eastern Fathers and their Byzantine appropriators. This was important from a different angle in the first volume of this work. Pagan antiquity of course knew that some entities were personal and some were not, but understood being a human person as simply one characteristic of being a human being and being a divine person as one characteristic of being a divine being. For pagan antiquity's theology, being is the embracing category, and personhood is secondary. Christian theology was compelled to drastic revision. In the Cappadocian and Neo-Chalcedonian doctrine of Trinity, personhood is not an aspect of God's being but is rather correlated to the three who live deity, also when we speak of the Trinity Himself as personal. That the three are God is a characteristic of the specific personalities they are. It is divine personhood, not divine being, that is metaphysically primary. The contest between the concepts of personhood and being would of course be moot if the first volume's revision of the latter concept were followed. In order to recognize orthodoxy's point without constant circumlocution, the preceding and following few paragraphs prescind from that proposal. It is a chief truth of Eastern insistence on the Fathers as monarchy. It is not God's divinity, not His being, that is the origin of the triune life, but the Father as person. God is not first divine and thereupon triune. He is first triune and thereupon divine. The Father's love, an exclusively personal reality, is the origin of the Son, and the Father's personal intent to be free in order to love is the origin of the Spirit. It is, moreover, the Father with the Son in the Spirit who are the one God. If God exists, He exists because the Father exists. Since with God personhood is prior to being, it must be so absolutely. Within thinking enabled by the Cappadocian achievement, it is the fact of personhood that enables entities to be entities and not vice versa. Also, things that are themselves impersonal belong to a creation that results from the Creator as a personal freedom beyond it. This contradicts all pagan antiquities. Theology, for which even divine personhood and freedom, if affirmed at all, are phenomena within the itself impersonal whole. But are there other persons than the divine three? Can there be created persons? If the ground of God's personhood and freedom were His divinity, if personhood were a predicate of beings of a certain sort, then such freedom would surely be an exclusive predicate of divine beings. But since it is the other way around, since God's free personhood is the ground of His nature, the triune communion is not bound even to the purity of its own deity and can open to others than the three if God so wills it, and then as respondents in that communion these others will also be personal. We have arrived again at a central position of this work, and one to which we have come from several starting points. It will be the task of this chapter to analyze human personhood as it is created by God's triune personal life. A decisive caution must stand at the beginning. We must not be guided by any general principle of likeness, so as to trace the structure of human personhood from that of divine personhood. We could thereby easily violate Thomas Aquinas's principle, which we have regularly invoked, that essence and existence are distinguished in creatures and not distinguished in God. We have described a triune person as an existent with no other reason than his own existence and that of other persons who are the same being he is. We must not so describe created personhood. In the first volume, we analyzed personhood around three poles: transcendental unity of apperception, ego, and freedom. The previous paragraphs suggest continuing in these terms. It is not thereby proposed that they provide the only terms in which the analysis might be conducted. This is also the place to warn that discourse about the I, or ego, is easily misunderstood, since throughout the modern period the word has been used for different things in different theories. This chapter will speak of the ego in a relatively commonsensical way, it is the entity we denote with the subject term of such first-person descriptive or hortatory sentences as "I painted that house" or "I ought to be more energetic." 2. The phenomenon Emmanuel can call the transcendental unity of apperception surely obtains. We would not call an entity personal that was not conscious, that did not in Kant's peculiar language apperceive, nor would we call a consciousness personal that was not focused at a viewpoint. A personal consciousness is precisely transcendental, that is, a perspectival focus that is not itself within the field there focused. It is perhaps just possible to conceive a consciousness that was from no viewpoint. The modern sciences in their first flowering drew a picture of the universe that if perfected would have been a view from nowhere. And Aristotle conceived a consciousness whose whole content might be such a picture. His God is a universal consciousness without perspective, the consciousness perhaps of an omniscient and passionless classical physicist. But Aristotle's God is not, and therefore the metaphysical situation his reality would establish not only does not obtain but could not have obtained. God is Father, Son, and Spirit. Each is other than the other two, and each is a person, and since a divine person is a subsisting relation to the other divine persons, each of Father, Son, and Spirit is precisely a perspective. Moreover, since there are created persons only as enabled within the triune community of persons, the proposition is universal, all consciousness is perspectival. It will be seen that these arguments reproduce arguments of the first volume, the other way around. Thus Kant's phenomenological observation is not theologically neutral, whatever Kant may have supposed. Indeed, however far Kant may have departed from specific Christianity, the insight he followed was enabled only within the history of Christian theology. The pioneer of the first-person standpoint as an epistemic attitude seems to have been Augustine himself. Augustine's reflexive identification with his own subjectivity was undoubtedly shaped by his Neoplatonism, with its cosmological and psychological pyramid stemming from the one through mind. But he would hardly have come to it had he not also been a worshipper of the Christian God. The Creator was the supreme goal of Augustine's consciousness, and unlike Greek deity, the Creator is too intimate to his creatures to appear in our knowing only as something we know. However encompassing and dominant, he must be apprehended as the underlying principle of our knowing activity itself. Just in this reflection, Augustine drew attention to our consciousness in its own depth, and made us aware of this in a first-person perspective. God's consciousness is focused and so is ours, and of both facts we can give some account. As Augustine perhaps did not quite say, divine consciousness is focused because each of the persons God is has dramatic location in and by community with the others. And human consciousness is focused by its accommodation in this same mutuality. Thus transcendental unity of apperception, wherever it occurs, is enabled by the triune life. And the unity of consciousness is therefore always a narrative unity. It has the integrity of a location within a story and is unitary because the story is coherent. Just so it occurs in and by virtue of community, foundationally by virtue of the triune community. Here an error is to be avoided. The Kantian notion of a transcendental unity of apperception is individualistic as he uses it. The rest of the world provides raw data, which are then pulled together into an experienced world from the inalienably private focus of my consciousness. The intent of this chapter would be radically perverted were its appropriation of Kant's notion to carry this supposition with it. There are no raw data of experience. The world that I receive and unify in my experience is always already the world interpreted in the discourse of a community. First the community of the Trinity and then the human communities I thereupon inhabit. And I experience reality from a perspectival point precisely because I am located in those same communities. The triune narrative and the triune community are in contingent fact God's history with a human community actual in that history. We humans belong to the triune history and community only by virtue of this contingency. None of us nor all of us together are one of the Trinity. We belong as those whom the Son brings with himself, whose whole life and intention are the others to whom he is sent and for whom he died. Thus we created persons have each our perspectival integrity as we are simultaneously located within divine history and community and within human history and the human community. This is true both of the human person Jesus and of the rest of us, but differently. According to our Christological conclusions, the identity of the eternal Son is the human person Jesus. Thus the viewpoint from which this man grasps reality is identically that of the one whose place in the human narrative and community is that of a Palestinian Jew, Mary's child, an unordained rabbi, one of Rome's victims, and so on, and that of the one whose place in the triune narrative and community is that of the Son of the Father and the defining beneficiary of the Spirit. With each of the rest of us, the viewpoint from which consciousness stems is that of one of those for whom this Jew and prophet and victim lived and died, and who is some particular one of them as, for example, a lay deacon, a professor of physics, Susanna's child, and so on. Just and only so it is also that of one of those who appear with the Son before the Father in the Spirit. It is apparent that those who do not acknowledge the Son must be in constant danger of mislocating the viewpoint from which they are conscious, and so of losing perspective on their world. They do in fact grasp the world only from a position within the Christological story but do not know that they do this. What brings my experience, in Kant's sense, together to be my experience is nothing I am by myself, Kant and his successors to the contrary. It is the coherence of the narrative in which I belong, and it is the justice of the community of that narrative. Or we may say it is the grammar of the language of that community, in which it tells its narrative. Both as I narrate my life and as I live in community, I must be competent in a language I do not invent. The givenness of a specific language and my induction into it are, in Kant's proper sense, a transcendental condition of unified consciousness. The transcendental viewpoint of those whose community is finally the church and only in the meantime other public things, and that of those whose community is the latter only have the same abstract structure. To avoid God, modernity and its precursors posited a focus of consciousness that was itself this abstraction, the same for all by virtue of its pure formality. No such thing subsists. My life has originating focus either within the community of the church and the communities of the libido dominandi or within the latter communities only. I can, to be sure, pretend I am self-existent, the condition of my own hypostasis. And I can try actually to live by that pretense, in violation of the conditions by which I subsist to pretend things. Sin, which is always itself the same old thing, has many faces. One is acting as if my essence and existence were not distinct. Augustine was led to the transcendental unity of his own consciousness by his passion for God. Within the reflection he inaugurated, to seek only myself at the focus of my consciousness is to mistake myself for God. A great deal of Western epistemology is simply Eve's and Adam's error. 3. In the foregoing, a step was elided. The transcendental unity of a hypothetical human consciousness was described as that of one of those for whom this Jew and child and prophet and victim lived and died, and who is some particular one of them as, for example, an American, a professor of physics, and so on. But this use of identifying descriptions anticipated its justification. A focus of consciousness simply in and of itself, even if that focus is a place in a community and narrative, would not be that of a describable someone. And so, it would not be personal. That I from the focus of my consciousness identify that of which I am conscious as included in my experience, in such fashion that my has descriptive content, depends on my identifying myself as, continuing the hypothetical case, one of those for whom Jesus died and among them as an American, a professor of physics, and so on. It depends, that is, on finding myself as a describable object. The I in that so-and-so is I remains to be discussed. The I in I did that seems on face value to have the same function as John in John did that. The point of my saying to you, for example, I painted the house is to point out an entity within the experience of us both that is claimed to be the agent of the house's new appearance. The claim moreover is arguable between us. If this face value is accepted, my ego is something within the field of my consciousness, there or me as it is for you, and in the presently relevant respects there for me just as John or Mary is there for me. At face value, it belongs to my personhood that I recognize myself in a figure presented to my consciousness by the narrative and community in which I am located, so that this ego is not itself located at the perspectival point from which I recognize it. It belongs to the face value of our self-referential language that there is a structure of deferral built into personhood, that the two personal pronouns In I recognize that I did that do not initially point in the same direction, but must catch up with each other. At the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries, Maurice Blondel, earlier mentioned, built a specifically Christian theory of personhood on the observation of such deferral, though not under that label, that was profoundly subversive of established modern social and psychological theory. He traced an intrinsic dynamic of human life by which we are kept from premature identity with ourselves. The will is driven from its occupation in immediate experience, through explicit willed action and through unmediated exterior expansion, into communally mediated action. Each step is precipitated by the same contradiction: the willed end is not equal to the principle of the will itself. We can neither refrain from moral action nor be content in what any action makes of us. It is impossible to find ourselves as we will to be, impossible to stop, to go back, or to go forward by ourselves. In my action there is something I have not yet been able to understand and equal. It is, said Blondel, the antecedent if unrecognized presence to each human will of the infinitely different will of God that creates this self-contradiction within human action. Man does not equal the fullness of his spontaneous aspiration through his deliberate intention except on the condition of annihilating his self-will by installing in himself a contrary and mortifying will. This conflict explains the forced presence of a new affirmation in consciousness, and the reality of this necessary presence makes possible in us the consciousness of this very conflict. There is a one thing necessary. The entire movement brings us to this term, for it is from this term that the determinism itself begins, the whole meaning of which is to bring us back to it. It has been a defining character of modernity to deny the face value of our experience, with its inner deferral, and insist that the ego I can know and describe is somehow itself the transcendental unity from which I grasp it. That is, it has been a defining character of modernity to deny the Augustinian restlessness, to insist that I am antecedently identical with myself. The denial is carried out in practice by what has been called exigent introspection. The great endeavor of modernist human self-understanding in all fields has been to turn consciousness instantaneously back on itself, in hope of catching a glimpse of the I that I know and will as myself, at work as itself the gathering focus of that knowing and willing. We may take William James's Principles of Psychology as a classic statement of the modern effort and also as a paradigm and typical victim of it. The vast work states its contention and its method plainly enough. Introspective observation is what we have to rely on first and foremost and always. The first fact such introspection discovers is that thinking goes on. The second is that a thought is never just this thought or that thought, but my thought. The universal conscious fact is not feelings and thoughts exist, but I think and I feel. Thus the flow of consciousness includes consciousness of its own continuity. The next step of introspection must be to spy out this continuity, that we call for myself, I or me. We are looking for the I in I think, feel, will such and such. Looking for this entity, James first finds the complex of material things, starting with the body and including family and friends, that we identify with ourselves and that expands and contracts with circumstance. Next appears the social self. This is the recognition that we get from one another. According to James, a man has as many social selves as there are individuals who recognize him. But these various material and social selves are too adventitious to one another, temporary, and miscellaneous to account for there being one self to have them. We must turn our attention to our consciousness of them and the identification of ourselves with that consciousness. Now we seem to discern, somehow in the stream of consciousness, an innermost center, compared with which material and social selves seem transient external possessions, each of which in turn can be disowned, whilst that which disowns them remains. Can we catch a glimpse of this self of all the other selves? James initially seems to succeed. He discerns a spiritual something that seems to go out to meet the other contents of consciousness's stream. That is what welcomes or rejects otherwise floating thoughts and feelings as my thoughts and feelings. That is the source of effort and attention, and the place from which appear to emanate the fiats of the will. An agent of the self's unity thus appears, and seems indeed to appear to direct sensible acquaintance. This introspection, however, is still insufficiently exigent for James, too content with such abstractions as something We must try to be more concrete, to catch one of these manifestations of spontaneity in the act. But so soon as this final attempt is made, the center does not hold. Whenever my introspective glance succeeds in turning round quickly enough to catch the subject immediately in the act, all it can ever feel distinctly is some bodily process. Introspecting with maximum exigency, we discover no subject of experience at all but only the collection of objective phenomena, at the level of the material, not even the social, selves. Exigent introspection's quest for its own principle of identity in fact dissolves it. But perhaps one possibility remains. James had so far tried to discover the I that is the focus of consciousness in the I of which I am conscious. This attempt having undone itself, his final resource is to reverse the direction of internal viewing and try to discover the latter in the former. James turns to investigate, in his terms, the pure ego. Introspection must whip round more quickly yet, to catch the transcendental unity of consciousness functioning as itself the identifiable person. This too fails. The focus point of consciousness remains a mere postulate. All that can be verified introspectively is the occurrence of one pulse of consciousness after another, each recognizing prior pulses as parts of the, otherwise wholly unspecifiable, same self as me. The pulses hang together by various phenomenal relations, and that contingent fact is as far as our quest reaches. Where are we left? We are in fact back with what we called the face value position, only now as the result of failure. There is the transcendental unity of consciousness, necessarily posited but not describable as anything I can find in myself. There is the miscellany of objective material and social candidates to be the ego, by which consciousness must make shift to identify itself. And there are successive pulses of this self-identifying. We are left where we must either cease to insist that the focus of consciousness and the ego must be antecedently identical and develop the resultant face value position, or persist and thereby disintegrate what we seek. It can be argued that late modernity and postmodernity are one long demonstration of such persistence and disintegration, perhaps most apparently in the arts and in our personality disorders. By this pairing it is not suggested that the modernist arts are devoid of great achievement. The present work is not the place to carry out the argument. Two brief observations only are offered. We may adduce the defining penchant of modernist visual art, the disintegration of personal narrative. Why is the woman in the paradigmatic work of modernist painting, Edouard Manet's De Juna sur Iherb, so singularly naked? Why does no one notice? And what is she thinking about so smugly? Since she no more attends to her companions than they do to her. The whole deliberation of the painting is to provoke such narrative questions and prevent all answers. The naked lady is in fact dropped in from another painting altogether. The act of the painting is sabotage of the painting's own suggestions of narrative. And if we ask what the consciousness evoked by James's introspective pressure would be like if actually lived by an individual, the answer is fairly obvious. It would be the specifically modern kind of madness. Schizophrenia, apparently undocumented before the late 18th century, was at first, and in itself tellingly, about the diagnosticians, interpreted as resulting from an undeveloped sense of self. It is surely the opposite, the havoc wrought in a consciousness lived, for whatever reason, in all too exigent awareness of itself. It was all very well for James, in his society, to rest content with this outcome. But if all we grasp about the unity of the person is that successive pulses of consciousness do happen at the phenomenal level, to refer to other such pulses as predecessors, and that this sequence of events does contingently string together offerings from the miscellany of material and social selves, we lack any assurance that this must continue to happen, that is, that I actually exist as a moral subject. But exactly such assurance is the one thing needful for life to go on in less sheltered historical conditions. Christian theology has no need for such despair or acrobatics. It knows that something outside the individual focus of consciousness grants and guarantees its precision and steadiness, the coherence of God's life and the person's relation to it, and is therefore not surprised that introspection fails to discover the person's coherence. It knows also that there is not a sheer plurality of social identities presented to my consciousness, because not individuals but the one human community, constituted a unity by Jesus' life and death for all, presents me with my identification. And it knows that this material identity, the body, and this social identity are not really different things. The man Jesus identifies himself as a Palestinian Jew, Mary's child, who died for his sisters and brothers, and as Son of the Father and resting place of the Spirit. Each of the rest of us may identify her or himself as one of those for whom this one lived and died and lives, and who is particular within this community as the self seen and offered by this community and by others that recognize him or her. Thus the structures of the communities within which individuals have their transcendental focus and from which they receive their egos shape the structure of their personhood. There is a personhood proper to a representative democracy and a different personhood proper to a popular tyranny and so on. Moreover, the voices of others are constitutive within the individual's life. I am who and what I am precisely in conversation with those who offer me myself. The soteriological significance of these last points can hardly be overestimated. So long as it is supposed that the individual human person inhabits a sort of shell from within which he or she deals with others outside the shell, the key soteriological propositions of Scripture are unintelligible. For example, it is not I who live but Christ who lives in me can at most be taken as overheated rhetoric. Finally, because theology knows these things, it can rest content with the one thing with which modernity could not be content, deferral of the subject's identification between itself as transcendental viewpoint and itself as ego. Indeed, it calls this deferral freedom and regards the freedom of the supposed autonomously self-contained individual as the most barren of slaveries. I am not bound within my own self-equivalence. It is not so that I intractably am what I am what I am what. 4. The interpretation of created freedom is perennially controverted in the Western Church, and this is surely one point where aloofness from such broils has not been for the good of the Eastern churches. There are several notable places where we could join the argument. Martin Luther's reply to Erasmus, on the bondage of the will, commends itself by unique willingness to state and argue the issues without shielding equivocation. The phrase the free will has generated many cross-purposes. Those who affirm free will often affirm different things, usually without noticing, and those who deny free will often deny different things, regularly mistaking the opponent against whom they direct the denial. Thus Augustine explicitly teaches that the existence of human free will, liberum arbitrium in his fateful phrase, is an essential truth of Scripture and reason. Yet in modernity his doctrine of predestination is customarily cited as the paradigmatic denial of free will, as is his reiterated more general teaching that all human wills are so absolutely in God's power that he makes them incline to whatever he wills whenever he wills it. Vice versa, in the course of Luther's savage assault on free will, he offhandedly affirms anthropological features that some would say are all they ever meant by the phrase. We will not here try to straighten out the historical confusions of language and analysis. We will simply follow Luther's treatise, noting the phenomena adduced in it and following the arguments he attaches to them. Perhaps we may avoid some ambiguities by thus following the track of one interlocutor. Luther agrees with his opponents that human creatures have a dispositional property of being apt for willing action. We may put it so. The question, was Jones willing to go to Chicago or was he coerced, is a meaningful question, whereas the question, was that rock willing to fall or was it coerced, is not. Indeed, Luther considers human possession of the property a triviality too obvious for discussion. Moreover, when someone possessed of this aptitude makes a choice and is permitted by the circumstances to do what he or she has chosen, Luther says the action is done freely. Such action displays voluntas faciendi, or willingness, the contingent unity of choosing and doing. But if the great denier of free will affirms all the foregoing, what then is it he thinks we do not have? All Luther's arguments are directed against forms of the same supposition, that our wills are antecedent to themselves, that we not only choose but choose what to choose. This supposition, Luther argues, is absurd. It is, to begin, absurd to claim a power to alter the choices by which all our powers are marshalled in the first place. If contingent circumstances permit us to act upon courses we have chosen, our action is willing and free, and that is all that can or need be said. The claim that we can choose what to choose supposes that there occurs in us a sort of absolute willing, a will that does not yet will anything. This, Luther argues in very modern fashion, is a dialectician's figment that results from ignoring realities and attending to words, from the metaphysician's besetting fallacy of supposing that because we need a word for certain purposes, in this case the word will, to speak of our determinate choices, the word must therefore denote something merely by itself. Whether a word denotes by itself is settled only by experience, and if in this case we consult the facts of experience, we will find only our determinate choices and the circumstances that do or do not allow us to act on them. But why is Luther so urgent that we not make this claim, however foolish it may be analytically? The concern is soteriological. The claim supposes that the dispositional property of being apt for willing action is itself a sort of occult power actually so to act, is itself the sufficient condition of its own actualization. On the contrary, says Luther, if I am actually to act with voluntas faciendi, I must be seized, or rapt, into willingness by another than myself, and moreover such rapture is always determinate. Willing action, the making and carrying out of personal choices, is enabled only in community, only by the provocation of an antecedent and determinate other will. It is not enabled within me as a closed system. There are, moreover, only two by whom we are or can be thus seized, God and Satan. We are in fact seized by Satan, and so are unfree for God. This is the occasion of God's saving action. God's act is to seize us for himself and so make us unfree for Satan. Within either rapture we often act willingly. The usual choices of human life, to marry or not, to obey some civil law or not, to order steak instead of fish, and so on, are made and sometimes can terminate in action. Luther has withheld the great word libertas both from the dispositional property and from willing action simply as such. He withholds it also and vehemently from the rapture worked by Satan. But then Luther does finally let the word fall for the rapture by God. Indeed, he crowns it as a royal freedom, regia libertas. God seizes us for his booty, by his Spirit he makes us his slaves and captives, which is not bondage but royal freedom, that we willingly may choose and do what he chooses. It is God's appearance to seize us which qualifies resultant willingness of action as, at last, freedom. We may ask why it must be God who seizes us for freedom. Why cannot your promises or importunities seize me for freedom, or for that matter why is not Satan's rapture freedom? The answer is plain, though not explicit in any one set of texts. Rapture to freedom is not causative but participatory. Were you to be the ground of my freedom, it would have to be because you shared freedom with me, which you cannot do because you no more have freedom in yourself than do I. As for Satan, he is an empty parody of freedom, a sort of personification of his own bondage, so that although he can indeed seize me into a voluntas faciendi, this can only be that of those who consent to share his slavery. Liberum arbitrium belongs to God and to those with whom he shares it. But if, as Luther has argued, it is absurd to say that any will is antecedent to itself, how is it then meaningful to say it of God's will? How does a dialectical figment suddenly become a deep truth when it is predicated of God? And how is it now meaningful to speak of our sharing in this capacity? The clue is in the last feature to be noted from Luther's teaching. When God is on the scene to snatch us into freedom, it is always by his Spirit. It is not absurd to say that the triune God freely chooses his own determinate choices, for the Spirit is God and is precisely the freedom of the Father over against the Son, as whom the Father has what he chooses and in whom the Father knows what he chooses. Of a mondic will it is indeed absurd to assert that it chooses what to choose, but such a will is precisely what God is not. It would also be absurd to say that human persons as individuals have or can share God's triune free will. But as members of the community whose uniting and animating Spirit is God the Spirit and who therefore stand with the Son before the Father, we share the liberation that the Spirit brings the Father and the Son. True human freedom, or anyway the sort that Luther is willing to dignify with the name, is an ecclesial reality. All this is true of the man Jesus and of his sisters and brothers in the church, only differently. The risen Jesus, as present to and in the church, is at once liberated by the Spirit and giver of the liberating Spirit, so that it can even be said, the Lord is the Spirit. And where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. It cannot be said of us, individually or together, that we are the Spirit or that where we are there is freedom. But with the risen Jesus, as the totus Christus, we other members of the Church are free as he is. Individually, we are being freed, as we live into the free community. As for those who do not yet belong to the Church, they act willingly within the communities whose uniting principle is the libido dominandi. They are creatures of the triune God and do not escape God's choice that their human choices occur freely, nor is the Spirit who evokes all created spontaneity other than the Spirit who enlivens the Church. There is of course an inherent contradiction, that Satan's rapture is a sphere of the Creator Spirit's presence. It is the same contradiction we have encountered whenever the word sin has fallen. 5. So far, this work has used the word soul only to quote Socrates. This may be surprising, since the word has traditionally provided the overall rubric of theological anthropology. Do we, a la Socrates, have souls? It depends on what one means by soul. For it might be said that these 3 chapters have all along discussed nothing else than the fact and nature of the human soul. In the Hebrew Old Testament, the word translated soul, nephesh, is a word for the human person as such, insofar as he or she is living and active and effective within community. A key passage of the second creation narrative, so far omitted from our account, tells that God, having formed the man from the dust of the ground, then breathed into his nostrils the breath of life so that the man became a living soul. It is not soul itself that is breathed into the not yet living man, and what comes of God's breathing is not that the man acquires a soul but that he becomes one. Implicitly, our whole discussion of human personhood has had this passage as its guide. The Greek of the New Testament displays no similarly consistent anthropological terminology. Comparing with the Old Testament, we may note that the word sometimes translated soul, psyche, shows a certain shift away from denoting the living person to denoting the life of the living person. Thus in Jesus saying, "Those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake will save it," the word translated life is psyche. When psyche then appears paired with body, soma, the difference is between life and that which might not live or no longer lives, thus the destroyer can kill the body but not the life itself. Here it may appear that soul and body can be independently dealt with. It is by way of such language that a different sense of soul will enter Christian thinking. Soul, as mostly encountered in Scripture, is what anthropologists have called body-soul, a representation of the difference between the living person and the corpse. Socrates' soul, very differently, is what has been called an escape soul, a representation of the person's seemingly possible liberation from his or her own body, as in dreams or shamanistic practice. It is soul of this second sort of which Socrates could say that death is or nothing other than the release of the soul from the body, and that the good person practices and longs for just this separation, in which human personhood first achieves its true nature. This is the soul that Platonism located decisively on the upward side of a metaphysical distinction between spirit and matter. And this is the soul that became ambiguously fateful for Christian thinking. Christianity adopted the Socratic notion of the soul not so much for its anthropologically interpretive power, which is in fact nil or close to it, as for its apparent eschatological service. What of the dead who have died in the Lord? Their bodies are in the earth. Is that where they are? They are to rise in the body, but what of the meantime? Thus the one New Testament appearance of souls actually separated from their bodies is in the revelation, "I saw under the altar the souls of those who had been slaughtered for the word of God," where they are waiting for the final redemption. The very thing that makes the Socratic notion of soul seem useful for eschatology is what creates the difficulty in our present context. Christianity attributes to embodiment a worth Socrates did not. The body is constitutive for the identity of the person. For Socrates, the soul that departs its body is the person perfected, whereas the Christian creeds locate the perfecting of the person not in the survival of the soul but in the resurrection of the body. Thus the adopted Socratic notion of soul has through theological history been a fruitful source of puzzlement. In the Aristotelian language which Western scholasticism adapted to state the difficulties, the Socratic soul is a substance, that is, it does not require any other created reality to exist. But the human embodied person is also a substance. Given their creation, the soul and the bisouled body both subsist in themselves. The question then has been, how are these two substances related? It was understood that they could not be regarded as two substances who merely happen for a time to be associated. Theology was never quite so alienated from Scripture as to suppose such a thing. After centuries of convoluted discussion, Thomas Aquinas devised a solution that is satisfactory if one accepts certain other scholastic positions. The soul, according to Thomas, is the former of the body, that is, the principle of that liveliness that distinguishes a body from a corpse. In this relation, we may say, Thomas's soul is a body-soul. Nevertheless, the soul must also be a substance other than the body, for its defining activity, consciousness, is in principle independent of bodily mediation, even though contingently it is in this life so mediated. In this relation, Thomas's soul is an escape soul. Finally, this independent substantiality of the soul can be conceived because, although the soul is not matter instantiated by form, being itself the form of the body, it is nevertheless form instantiated by the act of existence. Only one, but of course one is fatal, of the propositions on which Thomas relies is unacceptable within this work, that our creaturely consciousness is in principle a disembodied act. Sheer cognition may just possibly be conceivable as such an act, by abstracting the notion of sight as did the chief Greek thinkers. But our actual created consciousness is not so pure. It is compound of hearing and seeing as sensuous acts, and of smelling, tasting, and feeling as well, all apprehensions of external reality not readily attributable to a disembodied spirit. This is a convenient place to make explicit what has been assumed through this volume, the personal body, as the person's availability to others and thereupon to him or herself, is just so constituted first in those modes of presence that resist dissolution into subjectivity. William James should not have been so disappointed to find only objective and material phenomena by which to constitute his ego. One might even say that my body is a way of referring to the logical product of I see, I taste, I smell, I touch, and so on. The discourse of systematic theology, as that of philosophy, too easily elides the sensuousness of human being. Let this paragraph at least recognize the temptation. Nor has theology generally, popular or scholarly, been up to the subtlety of Thomas's solution. It may safely be said that nearly all Christians, once habituated to think of themselves as having a soul, have tended to revert to Socrates' pagan simplicity and conceive the soul as the real person hidden somehow in the body, until we die and our souls go to heaven. But such devaluation of embodiment cannot cohere with the gospel, and must be repudiated no matter how embedded in piety. If we must speak of souls, it will perhaps be best to discipline ourselves to the sense that predominates in Scripture. The soul is simply the person in his or her liveliness and communal uniqueness. And the person, the soul, if we will, does not have the body as something else than itself. The body is the very same person insofar as he or she is available to others and so to him or herself. We will have to deal with the eschatological problems without much help from Socrates.